So today's presentation is going to take about 30 minutes, and then we'll follow it up with some Q&A. And just to introduce myself, I'm a product manager here at Fluke Biomedical. So my role here is to develop a lot of the great products that you guys see coming to market, and interacting with a lot of you guys in developing those. So that's kind of my role here. And today, what we're going to go over is inhalational anesthesia, and we're going to talk about its history, how it's delivered to patients, why it should be tested. We'll go through how to test it and some best practices along the way. If at any point you guys have questions, you can type those into the Q&A in the way that Dan showed you, and we will show you those instructions again at the end to make sure that you get those questions in. So first, I want to start with the history, and this is just a brief history on how this all started. But in the early 19th century, Henry Hickman started noticing that by administering carbon dioxide on animals, he started to see a sort of anesthetic effect. And as we moved on to 1842, we got a bit more kind of high tech, and we started using diethyl ether. This was used for some dentistry kind of procedures, and it was also used to remove a growth, and that led to it being kind of accepted as an anesthetic there. And this was also around the time that nitrous oxide was used by Humphrey Davy, and nitrous oxide is something that's still being used today, so that one really hasn't gone out of flavor. Today, what we've kind of moved towards are halogenated inhalational agents, and the reason why those are being used are for their rapid induction, for their emergence, and for their low tissue solubility. Those three things have kind of made them the anesthetic of choice. And as we go through the timeline here, as they get released, halothane was released in 1957, and enflurane was released in 1963. Both of those have kind of gone out of preference. Halothane because of halothane hepatitis and how that can happen in its administration, and enflurane can also cause epileptic convulsions. So both of those have almost gone out of preference, but isoflurane, sevoflurane, and desflurane are all currently used. They're the most common. But those are the five anesthetic agents that are still being used today. So in terms of inhalational anesthesia, what are we trying to do? Inhalational anesthesia is trying to depress the central nervous system, it's trying to relax the musculoskeletal system, and it's trying to depress the respiratory system as well. In terms of medical terms, what we're trying to do is cause analgesia, which is the loss of response to pain, amnesia, which is the loss of memory, immobility, which is the loss of motor reflexes, hypnosis, which is unconsciousness, and paralysis, which is skeletal muscle relaxation. Ultimately, the goal is to have a patient that can't move, that can't feel, and can't remember basically what is happening to them because of some undue effects that can happen if any one of those is missing, and we'll get into that in the future. So inhalational anesthesia is typically delivered by an anesthesia delivery system, and the anesthesia delivery system has two main purposes. One is respiratory support, which is provided by the ventilator, in this case the bellows, and the second function is to administer anesthetic agent, which is what the vaporizer does. Aside from the ventilator and the vaporizer, there are other components that make up an anesthesia machine, such as the fresh gas delivery system, the anesthesia gas scavenging system, or AGSS, flow meters that regulate the flow of carrier gas, and as well as some monitors, right? So there's a breathing monitor that's typically attached, as well as a patient monitor. So all of these make up the anesthesia delivery system. So the first concept we want to go over is the circle rebreathing system. And this is basically the system in which an anesthesia machine works. So if we start at the top left with the fresh gas supply, this is where you're going to turn your carrier gas on. This is where, in this case, it's blue, so we're sending oxygen through this system. And this is what's going to keep the patient breathing, right? Breathing something that's useful to them. So that's the first input to the system. Further down the line, there's a vaporizer. So the vaporizer is going to be used to sedate the patient in the ways that we just talked about. And that's going, in this case, it's going to administer sevoflurane. And both of those things are going to be sent all the way up to an inspiratory one-way valve. Now, there's an inspiratory one-way valve and an expiratory one-way valve. And what they do is they prevent gas from flowing in the opposite direction. So we always want it going, in this case, clockwise. So the inspiratory valve will open when the patient breathes and allow the oxygen and sevoflurane to enter their breathing passage. And then when they exhale, they're going to exhale some leftover oxygen that wasn't metabolized by the body, sevoflurane that wasn't metabolized by the body, and CO2. So what's going out of the body is different than what's coming into the body. The expiratory valve will then open so that it pushes the three gases out and pulls in oxygen and sevoflurane for the next breath. So once it passes the expiratory valve, it'll go into the reservoir bag. And this is basically just a storage area for these gases. And then they get passed on with each breath further into the carbon dioxide absorber. And in many systems, the soda lime mixture will turn purple, which will show that carbon dioxide was absorbed. And then it will re-enter that same circle breathing circuit with just the leftover sevoflurane and the leftover oxygen, and the whole process will start over again. One thing to note is the APL valve. That's the adjustable pressure valve. So what that's going to do is prevent any overpressure events from occurring. So it will let off the mix of gas, so the carbon dioxide, the sevoflurane, and the oxygen into the anesthesia gas scavenging system to prevent the system from being overpressured. And again, that's adjustable. One thing to note is that the reservoir bag and the APL valve can be replaced by a ventilator if ventilation is needed. And the reservoir bag will expand and contract just like a ventilator does. So it will be controlled by the bellows, and the APL will be controlled by the ventilator as well to make sure that there's no excess pressure going to the patient. That, in general, is how the circular breathing system works. The second component is the vaporizer. So that was a part of the circle rebreathing system. But what the vaporizer intends to do is release a controlled amount of anesthetic to the patient. And how is this controlled? It's controlled through the control dial on the top. So you're going to set that to your intended dosage. And the way it's going to administer that to the patient is you're going to have carrier gas that comes in through the inlet port, and part of that is diverted into the vaporizer. And when it goes into the vaporizer, it's going to be sent past a wicking system. And what this wicking system does is picks up the anesthetic agent and allows it to get transferred into the gas mixture. Then this gas mixture will travel all the way back to the outlet port, where it gets mixed back in with the fresh gas flow, and that's what's going to be carried on to the patient. Many of these vaporizers also need to be heated. Desflurane vaporizers need to, and that's to ensure that this anesthetic agent uptake is to its calibrated spec. And that's basically how the vaporizer works. And we'll get into a little bit about how it can go wrong later in the presentation. So here I just want to inject a best practice, which is important in terms of understanding respiratory physiology and gas law. So we're not going to get into the two gas laws indicated here. This is the ideal gas law and Boyle's law, but it's really important to understand the relationship between two gases or the changes that you're making. So it's important to understand how the device under test, in this case the anesthesia machine, is operating, so that when a pressure or a volume or a flow is off, what will changing that have in terms of an effect on the rest of the system? What will that have in terms of an effect on the patient? Ultimately, what we're trying to do here is ensure patient safety. So use this as a sanity check to make sure that everything that you're doing in terms of your preventive maintenance or troubleshooting makes sense from your perspective. And the key to that is understanding how the body processes and how it respires, as well as how these gas laws operate. So another reason to test is things can go wrong. So we touched on what general anesthesia is trying to do, but you can under or over administer these agents, and those can have unintended consequences on the patient. So if you were to under administer agent to the patient might be aware or awake. It might be able to feel what you're doing to the patient. The patient might be able to move during the surgery. And all of these things can contribute to long-term psychological effects, because in many cases, the patient is feeling what's being done to him or her and can't speak or move to do anything about it. So you can imagine what can happen from a long-term perspective. In terms of over-administration, this can lead to cardiac arrest and even death. And we'll get into an example about that later. So what we're really trying to prevent here in testing is the under or over administration of these agents. We really want them to be administered at their intended dosage to make sure that the patients are safe. So in this case, the example I just talked about, we had a healthy 36-year-old woman who went in for routine surgery on her left arm. The anesthesiologist set the dial to 3.5%, and after 5 minutes, they realized that the patient was oxygen deficient. She went into cardiac arrest, and they gave her an epinephrine injection to bring her back. They went in and gave her an X-ray, and they found an accumulation of fluid in her lungs, and everyone was basically sitting there thinking, what went wrong? In this case, it was a cracked dial. So instead of administering 3.5% desflurane to the patient, she was getting 23% desflurane, so a huge over-administration in this case. And this is easily prevented, right? If someone had just done preventive maintenance on this vaporizer in a timely manner, this could have been found. And these are the things that we want to prevent because we don't want any patient to be harmed through this. And because it can be checked very easily and very often, we just want to let everyone know that these things do go wrong. So checking these is extremely important, not only to the patient, but also to your hospital system from a risk perspective. So that was an example of how the vaporizer can go wrong. But there are also so many other components in the system that can be faulty as well. In terms of the ventilator can be malfunctioning. The interlock system, which prevents more than one agent to be administered at one time, can malfunction. The anesthesia gas scavenging system can go wrong. The APL valve can malfunction. And the flow meters that administer carrier gas, those can as well. And of course, the monitors in terms of breathing and patient can both malfunction as well. So you want to really be aware of all the things that can go wrong in your entire system when you're thinking about troubleshooting and preventive maintenance. So one best practice to bring in here is to standardize your testing. Your standardized testing should start with the service manual or international standards, but you can always do more. The goal here is that you want to make sure that you are testing everything that your service manual or the international standard says. And those, in the case of an anesthesia delivery system, are going to be both the pressure and volume control modes of the anesthesia delivery system, But you also want to test all points, ranges of every parameter, of every flow parameter, volume parameter, things like that. In terms of test equipment, you want to make sure those make it into your standardized test procedure as well. What equipment do you need to do the testing so that everything is the same? Because when you test the same way every time, it reduces your risk, but it also allows you to look at the results over time and see if they're trending in one direction or another, which can be helpful for you to do preventive maintenance or predictive maintenance. Sorry. The other thing to note is lock this test procedure. Do not change it. If you change it, make sure you document why it was changed so that you have that traceability backwards in terms of why you updated, X, Y, and Z, so that people after you can understand what was done and why it was done. The second point to make is make sure you're testing things with a consistent inspection frequency. The service manual or international standard may tell you what the test intervals should be, but here's an example of using a more quantitative approach to determine how often you should test, in this case, a ventilator. And what this does is it takes the experience of your hospital with the device, as well as the industry's experience with the device, and helps you quantitatively assess how often you should be testing it. The first thing to look at is clinical function, right? So devices can range from having no patient contact to being a critical life support device. In this case, a ventilator is a life support device, so it gets a 5. Then they assess the physical risk, right? So in terms of if the device malfunctions, what can go wrong? Is that no risk all the way up to patient death? So you want to take that into consideration. Then there's the problem avoidance probability. This takes into consideration if you did preventive maintenance on it, could you have prevented that fault from happening? So that's another range that's looked at. And the last two are basically yes/no questions. But is there an incident history in the industry with this device? Yes or no? And that will give you a higher range there. And the last one is, what are the manufacturer requirements? Do they require something, yes or no? At the end of it all, you add it up and you figure out what range it falls into. So if it's less than 8, you can check it less than annually. 9 to 12, you want to check it annually. And 13 plus, you want to check semi-annually. And this system came from the Medical Equipment Quality Assurance Program Development and Procedures book written by Toby Clark. So if you want to check that out a little bit more, there are some good examples per medical device as well. But just to wrap it up, in this case, the ventilator scored a 17, so it should be checked semi-annually. So it's just another way to look at how you assess your inspection frequency. Another best practice is to write one comprehensive test. Testing, I noted this earlier, but testing an anesthesia delivery system isn't just testing the vaporizer and ventilator functionality. It's also powered by electricity, so you need to do electrical safety testing. It also has a patient monitor, so you need a patient simulator to test everything here. So here we have pictured our ESA, our electrical safety analyzer product family, as well as our patient simulator product family, all of which can meet those needs, along with our VT900A and Vapor, which belong to our gas flow analyzer family. So it's more than just gas flow analyzers that are needed here. So in terms of vaporizer testing, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. One thing that can happen is that you can misfill the vaporizer. So although the agents are keyed so that you shouldn't be able to fill a vaporizer with the wrong agent, it can happen. So just keep that in mind, that might be an issue. It may be misfilled with the wrong agent. You can oversaturate the wick by tipping the vaporizer more than it should. And tipping or saturating the wick can give you agent concentrations that are not what you intended, and it takes a while to fix that. So you want to be you don't know what happened in terms of how that vaporizer was transported to your machine, but you want to be able to make sure that this doesn't happen either. As we said in our example, the concentration dial can be broken. So the only way to really make sure that that doesn't work is by testing. And the other thing is, you see two vaporizers here. There's an interlock system that makes sure that only one can be administered at a given time. And you want to, those can be faulty as well. So you want to make sure those are working. So there are two main things that can prevent these. One feature that you should look for is automatic agent identification. So this will tell you what it sees. So the analyzer will tell you what it sees versus what you're looking for. So if you were looking in the sevoflurane vaporizer for sevoflurane and weren't finding anything, you might start scratching your head. Whereas if you hooked up a multi-gas analyzer that did have automatic agent ID, it would tell you that, hey, I'm seeing isoflurane and not sevoflurane, and then that should flag you down that something's wrong. The other thing is you should look for an analyzer that's able to measure two agents at the same time from a mix. So what this is going to do is be able to tell you if your interlock system is working or not. If you ever see more than one agent, you should know that something's wrong. This might be just leftover agent in the breathing circuit from the last time it was used. So if you flush it, it should go away. If it doesn't, something's wrong, and that could point you towards a faulty interlock system. So you want to be able to test more than just agent concentration. You want to be able to test your whole system, because that's really where the risk lies. And knowing what can go wrong should point you towards picking your gas flow test equipment to be able to perform the tests. So you might be moving around the hospital. You might need, all-day battery life. You might want onboard memory to be able to test at multiple sites and come back at the end of the day and download your test results. You might need to test anesthesia machines, right? It's probably why you're listening here. So you probably need ultra-low flow and ultra-low pressure. So looking through and asking these questions can help point you towards the right test tools to get you to make the right decisions. So testing all of the parameters and the ranges in the accuracy that you need is key, right? That's going to give you confidence in your test results. But you may have workers that are new. How do you bring them up to speed? Is it easy to learn? Again, we talked about storing data. Can you automate it, right? Is portability something that you're looking for? And in terms of vaporizer testing, can you test all 5 agents and all of their ranges? To the point we just made, can you test 2 agents simultaneously in a mix? As we saw, that has a huge risk mitigation factor there. And then automatic agent ID. These are all things you should be looking for as you look to choose your test equipment. So a little bit on technology in terms of how anesthetic agents are measured. The technology is called infrared photospectrometry. And basically what it is it measures the absorbance of wavelengths of light, infrared in this case, by gas molecules. And each agent has a different absorbance profile, but you can see they're all lumped together in the middle. So this is, a pretty high-tech application here. So because the differences between these wavelengths aren't very large, you need a test device that can do that. Two that can do it, so 2 technologies are dispersive infrared radiation, which uses a prism to separate those wavelengths. And the more common non-dispersive infrared uses optical filters to separate those wavelengths. And again, this is the most common technology being used on the market. So basically, it's just saying, okay, what are those absorbance profiles? How do I break them apart so that I can identify each agent? Another best practice is to use a third-party test device versus CalGas. So calibration gas is typically used to measure a respiratory gas monitor, which is then used to measure a vaporizer. So when you take those into consideration, you're adding tolerances together. So you're adding X% to Y%, and in this case, getting something that's greater than what you're looking for. So what the goal, if you take 1% accuracy for the calibration gas and 5% for the respiratory gas monitor, you get an accuracy range of anywhere from -4% to +6%. So you see how those additive tolerances can really have an effect. In terms of calibration gas, it's okay to calibrate your respiratory gas monitor with that. That gives you a pretty good accuracy there of around 1%. But in terms of vaporizers, using your respiratory gas monitor to do that testing is detrimental. It does add tolerance and add uncertainty. So it's better to just use a third-party test device to directly measure the output of your vaporizer, because that's what's directly hooked up to your patient. So that's something to take into consideration. So one thing that we looked at in terms of this entire application is there are a lot of jobs that have to be done here. You guys are testing the ventilator, you're testing the vaporizer, you're having to set up the tests, you're having to find the anesthesia machine, which isn't so much of a pain point here, and then you have all of that work order reporting that you have to do. So these are a couple of the pain points that you should think about when you're making your purchasing decisions in terms of, do I need multiple, modules for high and low flow? Do I have to do 2 test setups? Do I need to store my results? Is warm-up time a factor? Do I need to zero multiple times a day? Is portability a feature that I'm looking for because my current analyzer is in the shop? You want something that's legible, right? You want to be able to test ultra-low flow and ultra-low pressure. And, you're looking for all that stuff and more when you're doing vaporizer testing. So you want to be able to test all 5 agents. You want automatic agent identification. You need that onboard ID, but you also want to test more than just concentration, because that interlock system can be failing too. So you'd like to see 2 gases at the same time. And again, test setup is a huge pain point. So being able to set up a test profile that automatically loads all the units, concentration modes, everything that you need, and just be able to load it, hook up your inspiratory and expiratory outlets, and get running. That's a huge test saving. So we've addressed many of these pain points here, and we have some great products that we just want to show you quickly. So we have the VT650, which again has those test profiles, has an 8-hour battery life, onboard memory, and again, it has the best accuracy on the market right now. And the one thing is, this is not compatible with vapor. So you'd look to the VT900A for this anesthesia delivery system application. So here you're going to be able to add the external trigger. You'll have a better oxygen concentration of 1% with a 2-year life. And you'll also have the ultra-low flow and ultra-low pressure, which is needed for these low flow conditions found in the anesthesia delivery system. This is compatible with vapor, so you hook up the vapor module, and now you're able to test all 5 anesthetic agents, CO2 and N2O, and you're able to have auto identification and measure 2 gases, so you'll be able to identify those interlock failures and reduce your risk. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I just want to say, if you have any more to learn, you can go to the Fluke website. You can go to your local sales rep, and we have Advantage training online for many of our products, which is free on-demand training. We're also active on social media, so if you follow us on YouTube, we put a lot of videos up on there on a regular basis, so keep an eye out there for us.